Again. My name is Lisa Snell, and I am from the Reason Foundation. And at the Reason Foundation, our motto is free minds and free markets. And we have a magazine called Reason Magazine, a think tank that looks at public policy from a market perspective. And we also have a TV division called Reason TV, where we've tried to use a viral distribution model on YouTube to produce lots and lots of free market-oriented videos. In fact, Michelle Fields, the woman that was in the video that Michael Cox showed, has done a lot of videos for us. And an example in education of our model, in Washington, D.C., they had a march with all of the teachers called Save Our Schools that you might have seen. And it was before the Occupy division of marches that have been going on lately. And Michelle Fields went to the Save Our Schools march in DC, and she had a conversation with Matt Damon and Matt Damon's mom. And Matt Damon told her that teachers only work out of the good of their hearts because they love students and they don't care about compensation. And he also claimed that it was nothing like film, where people do care about compensation in his line of work. And so that interview with Matt Damon went viral, and it got over 5 million views in 2 days. And for the left, it became Matt Damon is a hero and knows what teachers are really about. And for the reformers in education, it became a guidepost of just how delusional everyone is that works in the status quo for education. But so that's one of the things we do. We try to do a lot of very fast-paced, in the news oriented videos, as well as a lot of documentaries that we spend a lot more time on. So, we just released a 30-minute documentary on international adoptions and the perverse incentives there and all of the kids in the world that don't get adopted because of perverse incentives. And then that we will be submitting to film festivals and all kinds of different things. So that's kind of in a nutshell the different mediums that Reason works in. Today, for our topic of free markets and education, I'm going to take a very rational, optimistic approach. And I think that what we need in education is a dose of Matt Ridley and the free exchange of ideas and innovation. And right now in education, in a nutshell, the situation that we face, we spend a lot of angst and time looking at things like the PISA and the OECD test scores of developed countries and where we rank. And we spend a lot of time worrying about, well, our students don't study long enough, we need national standards, we need better teacher quality and higher pay. And I would make the argument that if we had more of a market-oriented education system, we would no longer have to worry about all of those inputs. We don't need the federal government to set standards if we have a market in education and we exchange ideas. We don't need to tell every school that they should have a week longer of instructional time, as Obama is doing. That's one of his big fixes, is we just need to keep kids in their bad, failing schools longer, and things will get better. And I can guarantee you, my kids, I have a 13-year-old little girl and a 15-year-old son who go to public school, and the last week of school, no matter how long they make the calendar, guess what they do the last 7 days of school or so? They watch movies, they have parties. I would argue that if schools use the instructional time they already have a lot better through innovation, that schools would get better. So I'm going to go to my PowerPoint soon, but let me just tell you a story of a project I've been working on in Los Angeles. In LA Unified, it's the second largest school district in the United States, covers a 700-mile geographic area, if you can imagine that. It has over 600,000 students. But the interesting story about LA Unified is 5 years ago, it had over 800,000 students. So in 5 years, it's lost almost 200,000 students. There's 180 charter schools that surround LA Unified now. And those are schools, charter schools are the biggest example of education privatization in the United States. And there's close to 6,000 schools now serving 2.5 million students. But in many geographic areas, there's a concentration of charter schools that have gotten a much larger market share in a geographic region. And that's what's happened in LA Unified. And so a few years ago, when everyone in California, when we had a $20 billion deficit, which we seem to be maintaining, when there were a lot of teacher layoffs, the charter schools had 900 job openings. And so competition in LA has made things better for teachers and administrators and principals because the charter schools have a huge brain drain because they want the best human capital from that public system. And so many of the best administrators and teachers have moved to work in charter schools. Now, charter schools have their limitations. Are there bad apples? Are there bad actors? Yes. But in their case, just like Milton Friedman's vision of the voucher and the money following the child, in charter schools, you only get funded if a child shows up and enrolls in your school. There's no residential assignment. There's no guarantee that a kid will come. And you also have a contract to supposedly meet certain financial and academic accountability and goals. So you can be closed. Now, they probably should do more closing of charter schools and more closing of schools generally. But so in LA Unified, they've lost all of these kids. So they've decided that what they want to do is they want to make all of LA Unified schools like charter schools. And they want to get rid of residential assignment. They want to get rid of principals having norm tables and being told how to spend their money so that they would get their dollars at the school when the child enrolls. So the money would be attached to the backs of kids. They have 100 schools now that they're letting the principals have autonomy, and they get funded based on who shows up in the building. And next year, they're planning to move to all 800 schools in the district being funded on the same model, basically, as charter schools. So unfortunately, I'm not that optimistic about the district's initiative to do that. I think it's much better organically from the outside, but they would never have considered doing it if they hadn't been facing this pressure from all of these new startup schools that had grown up around them. But let me give you an example of how, so this summer, the 100 schools that have autonomy, I've been interviewing them to see how it's working out for them. So I go to one school, and it's Hamilton High. And it's the first thing you see is there's a list of things like every school that they want parents to donate and buy for the classrooms. Because even though they get $15,000 per student, and a class of 20 students should be generating $300,000, and the teacher's salary, right, is only maybe $90,000 of that tops in LA. I think average teacher salary in LA is $90,000. That's the average. The first thing on the list is cat litter. And you know why the first priority is cat litter? It's a big comprehensive high school. That's the first thing you see is a list that's asking you to buy cat litter. And you're thinking, why would they want cat litter? And then you read down, and it's other supplies for lockdown. And so it's baby wipes, it's disinfectant, it's cat litter. They have a plan that if the kids get locked in the classroom because things get so bad on the campus because of school violence, that's their alternative to letting them out of the classroom to go to the restroom. And so that's like the first thing that I see, like when I walk into the school. And it's self-evident, like what it's for. And so those kinds of signs, if you walk into a charter school down the street, I can guarantee you that that's not the first thing that you will see as a parent. So let me just give you an example of one of the schools. Fauché Learning Center, I just interviewed the principal there a couple of days ago. And this principal, the other thing about LA is they've had a $20 billion school construction building program in the last 7 or 8 years. They're the biggest example of public works building in the nation for the last 5 to 10 years. And so they've had a lot of very infamous schools that you probably read about that took years and years to build at the cost of over $500 million, the Belmont Learning Center being the most infamous, the Downtown Arts Center. You know, they spent over $500 million on a school for the arts downtown with soundproof studios and huge, kitchens that would be the envy of like the Iron Chef and all of these facilities. And now they're at 40% capacity at that school. They have no, most schools for the art, you at least have to audition, play piano, draw, sing. They focus on students that are interested in the arts. It's all residential assignment, so the kids that go there are not selected in any way for their interest in the arts. And so that's a typical way that they do things in LA Unified. So this learning center that I interviewed the principal that gets to control their budget, down the street they opened another brand new school, and then there's 3 charter schools next to her. So she's lost 1,200 kids in 3 years, and she controls her money in the budget. So when you have control of your budget, you can do things to innovate. You can have better attendance, you can make more money. You could have less substitute days, you could keep more of your money. You can hire, balance your staff so you don't have all senior staff, so you buy some less expensive employees. You can do things as a principal, and that's what charter schools do. They maximize their dollars, they spend money much more efficiently in many cases. So this woman increases enrollment by 5% and attendance, which is a lot, and it's a lot of money. So she makes $300,000 extra for a carryover for her next year's budget. And she thinks of this innovative structure, and she does all these things, and she involves the community and her instructional planning team, and she's really strategically looking how to budget for achievement and doing all of these things. Guess what LA Unified does? They say, well, we can't balance our budget because we have all these deficit schools. And so the 100 schools that have been doing per pupil as a pilot for the last 3 years, any carryover that any of you schools have, we're going to take all of that money to make the other schools whole. And that's the first thing they do, is the principals innovate, they act more like charter schools, they make money for their individual buildings, they get more parents to come, and then LA Unified takes the money away from them. So that's why it's very difficult in status quo, even when people are being innovative. As soon as they start to innovate, right, they're squashed down by everybody else who isn't allowed to innovate. So it'll be interesting to see how this continues to unfold. The other dirty secret of LA Unified is, like Detroit and many other cities, they have dozens and dozens of undercapacity schools that are 40 and 50%. And they have another 100 new schools that they're planning to open. At the same time, the charter schools are growing at a very rapid pace because they're able to get reauthorized as they replicate good, sound models for education. So there's going to be a huge collapse in terms of right-sizing there. So I'll make the argument that in 2011, school choice is winning. And you have to forgive me for the Charlie Sheen reference, but unlike Charlie Sheen, school choice and markets and education really are winning like never before. So this year, Jay Matthews, who's one of the most well-known education reporters for the Washington Post, said in an op-ed that he wrote that there won't be a wave of pro-voucher votes across the country. So this other researcher that works for the Milton Friedman Foundation for Educational Choice said, no, you're wrong. We are on a tipping point for education choice. His name's Greg Forrester, and he bet Jay Matthews that there would be at least 10 new programs or expansions in school choice. That's tax credits and vouchers, so not charter schools. We're in a new realm here. And so now, in 2011, Greg has been able to double down on the bet because we're actually at 21 new programs because 2 more just came online this week. And so these are some of the kinds of things that have happened. Louisiana has a new tax credit program, which Arizona has an education savings account program. And I'm going to go through some of these examples and kind of what the landscape for markets and education is looking like and why we should be hopeful. There's a lot of them. The first thing that happened that was good is that the US Supreme Court ruled that because tax credits leave money in the hands of taxpayers, they never become public funds. As a result, under federal law, taxpayers do not have standing to challenge the program. And what a tax credit is, an education tax credit, is either an individual or a corporation gets to take money off the bottom line of the tax that they would pay to the government and instead give it to, in the case of corporations, scholarship organizations to give kids scholarships to private schools, or in the case of individuals, you can also make a contribution to a scholarship organization. And then those organizations give kids basically a voucher or a scholarship to go to a private school of their parents' choice. So for example, this Supreme Court ruling was on the Arizona tax credit program, and that means that 30,000 kids in 370 private schools, and then everyone else who's doing this, because Supreme Court rulings tend to have lots of standing, are better off and get to use their tax credit to go to a private school. So that's pretty good. Boom. In Washington, D.C., one of the worst school districts still, despite Michelle Rhee's best efforts, when Obama was elected, he chose to send his own kids to a private school, and yet he wouldn't say a word about the D.C. voucher program where 1,700 kids were going to 50 private schools. And one of the first things that his administration and other people in Congress did was deauthorize the D.C. voucher program. And so there has been fights from many, many different organizations. Virginia Walden Ford, who's the mother of school choice in D.C., is largely responsible. But as part of the federal budget deal, the program's reauthorized for the next 5 years, and it can actually add several thousand kids. So that was huge this year, that activists were actually able to get that through. Kaboom. A new interesting program that's never been done before, a school district in Colorado, Douglas County, they decided, well, why can't we have our own voucher program? We'll just give vouchers to our own kids in our district. So the first local district, and for the first year of the program, they're giving $5,000 for 500 kids to attend the private school of their parents' choice. A school district letting their kids use vouchers to go to private schools. Pretty exciting stuff. Indiana passes the largest school voucher program in the nation, and the interesting thing there is most school choice programs are completely mean tested, which means at-risk kids who are the low-hanging fruit and who need vouchers and tax credits more than anybody else are usually the first kids that are targeted. But in Indiana, they actually raised the amount of money that a family could earn, and then they're also going to raise the cap over time so that in 3 years there will be no limit on the number of vouchers to eligible students, and it will not be income tested. So Indiana will be the first state that will have a universal school voucher program that is not only for at-risk disadvantaged kids. And here's a picture from the first day that the voucher program opened of families lining up to get their school voucher in Indiana. And it only opened up a couple of weeks before this school term started, and 4,000 kids in Indiana are using vouchers right now to go to private schools. And Catholic schools, which were on the brink of in Indianapolis and the inner city Catholic schools, we have this huge capacity program where we have tons of low-income kids that need a higher quality education. We have all kinds of Catholic schools with tons of seats, right, that these kids could go to, but can we ever figure out a financing mechanism to make that happen? In Indianapolis and Indiana, they've figured that out. So these Catholic institutions have been revitalized by this program. Boom. So school choice is winning. There's 26 school voucher and tax credit programs across the country in 2010. 11 are school voucher programs and 9 are scholarship tax credit programs. And let's just think about a market in education for a minute as a continuum, right? On the one side of the continuum, would we love to have a pure free market in education? So if you think of Marshall Fritz, does anyone know who Marshall Fritz was? He had an organization called the Separation of School and State. And he's one of the longtime advocates for completely separating the state from education. And so the huge growth in homeschooling is largely attributed to Marshall Fritz. So in addition to all of these things, we have almost 2 million kids now that are being homeschooled, and technology and just the sharing of resources makes that easier to do and more cost effective than at any other point in history. And that's, of course, the biggest barrier to homeschooling, is that somebody has to give up their earnings in many cases, especially when you have young children. So the less expensive and the easier that gets, the faster it will grow. So on one side of the continuum, you have that complete separation. And then you go down and you have charter schools, which are still public schools. They have lots of restrictions, but they have a lot of autonomy too. But a charter school leader will tell you that they've never met a law that they're actually exempt from, as much as everyone says that they have autonomy. So you have charter schools here, and then you have school vouchers, where you have competition and the money is flowing on the backs of children. And then you have tax credits where people keep their own money and it's not entangled with the public system at all. And this, in some ways, is the preferred, the less regulation, although you have to be internally vigilant because private schools are still always being regulated by the state. If you look at the laws for private schools in Texas or California, there's still lots of things that the state tells them that they have to do. So really, in the end, there's no way, there's no getting away from the state in education. You just have to be vigilant. But we have this continuum, and then as you go down the continuum this way, you have kind of public school choice and these weak magnet schools and things that are still completely controlled by public institutions and districts, but at least the money's attached to the backs of kids. And I want to make a plea that you should be agnostic to a certain extent about this. In the United States, we spend about $500 billion, and that doesn't include things like the extra $100 billion stimulus or the new jobs program that's being proposed. We spend about $500 billion on K-12 education every year for operating costs. That doesn't include pension obligations. That doesn't include capital costs. If you included all of those things, it would be a lot more money. But it's a huge industry. We spend, education spending has tripled since 1970. And whatever indicated, we spend more than any other country in the world per capita on education. So the economics, the cost is all very high, and it's been growing, 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 despite the commercials that you might hear on the radio from the teachers union. And every indicator is flat, right? SAT scores, not doing so well. Graduation rates are exactly the same as 1970. The National Assessment of Education Progress for 17-year-olds is flat, no improvement since 1971 in terms of reading and math. So they make a big deal about fourth graders. Yes, fourth graders are doing better, and they have been doing better for 25 years, a little tiny bit better. But if that goes away when you're 17 and there's no progress, graduating from high school is the indicator and what you know, not what you know in kindergarten. That's just the way it is. It's great if kindergartners make improvements, but if that falls off completely by the time you're 17. And so the only thing that saves us, Michael, is economic freedom. And in fact, Eric Hanishek did this huge study that the United States is a huge outlier. We're always seeing huge stories about how China and India and Singapore and Finland and everyone is beating us on all these different indicators. And yet, because of our economic freedom, when you tie student achievement to productivity, we still are kicking butt for the most part. Imagine if we had higher achievement and economic freedom, where we would be. So the lesson here is that we are never going to be China with a regimented education system, but we need a lot more innovation and exchange of models in our own system. So a few more examples. Ohio has 60,000 students with vouchers in the state of Ohio right now. Milwaukee, just in the city of Milwaukee, they're approaching 25,000 kids that use vouchers, and they have a lot of charter schools. And in fact, the union contract in Milwaukee has completely fallen because there's a charter school sector, most of the teachers work in the private school sector, and the public school sector. The only way that the public sector could get employees to teach in the public schools is to get rid of all the work rules and seniority restrictions and tenure restrictions that they had because they had so many charter schools and private schools that would hire them without those restrictions. So competition is good for the labor force as well as for the kids. This just shows you the trajectory of how many kids are using, and this is only vouchers and tax credits. This doesn't include charter schools, since 2001. So, and this does not include the huge number in 2011 that have been added on. And so what does the evidence show us? There's 10 gold standard studies with random assignment that show that vouchers improve student outcomes. Is it as robust as we would like? No. But if you look at the demographic of who's using vouchers, these are not the bottom 5% of kids. These are the bottom 1% in terms of student achievement. So up until this point, it's all at-risk kids that are taking advantage of these programs. But the key thing is that there's no study that shows they're not doing as well, and they do it for a lot less money. In Cleveland, the voucher is $3,000. In Wisconsin and Milwaukee, the voucher is about $4,000. So they're doing it for 40 to 50% less. And if you added in all those other capital costs and administrative costs of federal, state, and local programs, they're doing it for even less than that. 19 empirical studies, which are gold standard random assignment studies, show that the public school responds well to that competition. And the kids that don't use the voucher and actually remain in their public schools do better from the competition, and that there's no study that shows, unlike the rhetoric, that vouchers will cream all of the best students, they will go to the private schools, and the public schools will be left flailing. That hasn't happened. They've actually tried to get better and get the kids to come back to their schools. And then, so every study shows that they have improved the public schools around them. So it's a win-win situation. That's just a bunch of stuff I won't talk about. I already said that they're the largest example of privatization charter school. And let's just talk about the market share right now. There's more than 14 communities where more than 20% of, is there a clock? 2 or 3 minutes, okay. So more than 20% of public schools are enrolled in charter schools, and then Detroit's at 32%. But let's talk about New Orleans, because I'll just close with that. New Orleans is an all charter school district. After Hurricane Katrina, the school system completely collapsed, and they were relieved of contract law, and everything became invalid. And independent nonprofit organizations came in to provide the school capacity there. So there is no school board or school district. There's a New Orleans Parish School Board that has 9 schools, which also are all charters, but they're competing with a recovery, a state authorizer that's authorized all these individual things. And literally, like this year, almost every school kid in New Orleans is going to an independently run school. The dropout rate has fallen by 50% since 2005. And in 2005, 66% of the schools were failing. Now only 26% of the schools in New Orleans are failing. And they just had a new release of test scores. And New Orleans test scores are now encroaching on the wealthiest district in Louisiana in terms of their achievement. So it's been a sea change. It's all private organizations that are funded based on the money being in the backpack of the kid. And so that's really the city to watch in terms of what a market looks like in education. The key now is sustaining it, keeping the government from taking it back and encroaching on it. So, boom, school choice is winning. And oh, let me just go to the very end. I don't know why I can't make the button work, but I'll give you my last. School choice is winning. And you can see Charlie Sheen.